Hello, today I'm going to talk about the Southern Mississippi Campaign of the American Civil War and how it pertains to the topic of total war. So, firstly, to establish some context, after the Battle of Shiloh, the Western theater in the American Civil War is going to look a little different. So, Shiloh was an interesting battle because it was a Northern victory, but it made a lot of people in the North and also in the South mad because although at the time it was the biggest battle to ever happen to the United States, it didn't really gain a whole lot for the North. So, you have a Southern army that walks away after, they have a lot of casualties, sure, but the North didn't capture major parts of the army, and in fact, for the first day on April 6th, it kind of looked like the South was winning, because they were. They'd pretty much won the first day of battle. The only thing that got to them was that they ran out of time at the end of the day. So, I want to talk about this quote here. Up to the Battle of Shiloh, I, as well as thousands of other citizens, believed that the rebellion against the government would collapse suddenly and soon if a decisive victory could be gained over any of its armies. But afterward, I gave up all idea of saving the Union except by complete conquest. So that is from the memoirs of Ulysses S. Grant, who is going to be commanding the army at Shiloh and at the battles we're actually going to be talking about in this Delta campaign that's going to be taking place down there. Now, of this quote, I want to talk about two things pertaining to this slide, of course. One is this map right here. Now, I'm going to be talking about the Western theater of war. This is all considered the Western theater. Everything out here is the Trans-Mississippi theater. That's technically, even though it's the farthest west, the battles are going to be fought in the American Civil War, it's technically a different theater, just to establish some, and then the East, of course, is going to be up here in Northern Virginia, eventually down into Southeastern Virginia, up in Maryland and Pennsylvania. So, and then, of course, when Grant talks about armies, he is referring to multiple armies. So the South during the Civil War technically did not have a Confederate army like we refer to typically. What it was multiple armies like the Army of Northern Virginia, the Army of Mississippi, the Army of the West, that sort of stuff. So when he says later we're going to refer to him going down and following Johnston's army into Jackson, where they're going to siege them, Johnston has his own army. It's not under any sort of, there's no greater encapsulating Confederate army. It's a series of smaller armies that exist throughout this area. Just some interesting facts. So, now Grant talks about conquest in that quote. And in my opinion, this is just my opinion, so take it with whatever you want to take it with. The applications of conquest was that he was bringing the war now to secessionists both on and off the battlefield. So what this means is he's now not only fighting the Confederate or Confederate-leaning people on the battlefield, he is now bringing that war to everybody in the South who supports the Confederacy. Because there were pockets of the South which were pretty pro-Union. Think Eastern Tennessee. If you consider the non-seceded states, were all Southern. Maryland, Delaware, Kentucky, Missouri are all technically Southern states, but never seceded. So he is bringing the war to these secessionist Southerners, whether they be on the battlefield fighting his own men with guns and artillery, and also the people off the battlefield who are actually supporting the Confederate war effort. So just to kind of show that the war in the West really did turn to this conquest of the South before the war in the East did, I have a quote here from a Pennsylvania veteran who was fought in both the Eastern and the Western theaters. This is a quote he said at during the siege of Jackson, Mississippi. So we're going to talk about that a little later, but this is his quote: "War in this country is a very different thing. This is a war in earnest. Men will do 3 times of the Army of the Potomac." And if you look at the whole thing, he's referring to damage. So he's referring to, in the context, when he says they will do 3 times the Army of the Potomac, he's talking about damage to farms. But we'll talk about that when we talk about Jackson, where this quote actually comes from. So, some early Unionist struggles for Vicksburg. This is all now bringing it back to the southern Mississippi Delta. So, the Union had been trying to take the city of Vicksburg since October of 1862, pretty unsuccessfully. So the city of Vicksburg had began setting up defenses in late 1861. So pretty well fortified city. And in the Western Theater, pre-Vicksburg and during Vicksburg as well, you're going to see a lot of Navy involvement in battles. And in fact, battles like Fort Henry, even Fort Donaldson, Island Number 10, Shiloh, would not have been possible without the Navy. The Union Navy did a lot and contributed a whole lot in those battles that really helped those Union victories. So the Union Navy is going to try to take Vicksburg as early as October 1862. They're going to fail. They're going to have several failed attempts. Just off the top of my head, I can think Steele's Bayou. The Navy's heavily involved in that failed attempt. And they're going to have several like that are going to take place and are not going to result in the taking of the city of Vicksburg. So another thing that restricted the Union's ability to just walk into Vicksburg, because that's something people wonder is, well, if the Union significantly outnumbered the Confederate armies in the area, why did they not just walk into Vicksburg and take it? Why couldn't they just do an overland campaign like they had at Donaldson? And that's eventually what they would do, but there are several factors you have to play in. So number one is going to be guerrilla activity. In the South, there were lots of guerrilla bands that were obviously pro-Southern, that were fighting the Union almost to more, not more of a detriment, but to a detriment of the Union armies. So the other, and besides guerrillas, you have Confederate cavalry raids that are actually disturbing Union supply. And the South had some very astute cavalry generals, especially out west. You have Earl Van Dorn and Nathan Bedford Forrest, who are going to have several raids on Union supply that are going to deal millions of dollars in damage if you translate it in today's money. And in fact, one of Van Dorn's raids in particular did several million in damage. So, and then lastly, you have the terrain of Vicksburg itself. If you've ever been there, it's a city that's built on a bluff. It almost looks like a bit like the Dover bluff in England. You know, the big wall, pretty much, that goes right up to the ocean. But in this case, it's to the Mississippi River. So, in one Confederate soldier, a year prior to the battle, is going to have something to say about that. After the Lord of Creation had made all of the big mountains and ranges and hills, he had left in his hands a large lot of scraps. These were all dumped at Vicksburg in a waste heap. So I thought that was a pretty good quote. Kind of shows the really just the terrain itself of Vicksburg is already restricting a Union, just a straight bombardment of the city. Because if you drive one of those ironclads up to the side of it, it's really just going to be hitting the rocks. You're not going to have a whole lot of effect done to the actual city. And that was part of the Navy's struggle. And then right here I have a picture of an ironclad. I think that's the CSS Arkansas, if you were curious. Okay, now for the meat and potatoes of it. So we have total war at Vicksburg. So these are some examples of the actual, I hesitate to call it a battle. It really wasn't a battle. It was a several month-long siege. So of the siege of Vicksburg, here's just a few examples of total war. So Union gunboats at the time were accused of intentionally firing upon hospital areas of the city that were flying the yellow flag. And the yellow flag is before the Red Cross becomes the symbol of like peace, neutrality, like, you know, now you see it flown at like military hospitals and stuff. Areas that you're not supposed to fire on, the yellow flag was in this context considered, okay, I'm flying a yellow flag, this is a hospital, don't fire on this. So General Sherman is going to send Admiral Porter, who is the head of all of these Union gunboats, he's going to send him a newspaper article that is accusing him of it. And Porter isn't going to deny it, and Sherman's actually going to tell Porter, keep up the shelling to the maximum capacity in reference to that, because Sherman's argument was that I believe his exact words were calling it a ruse, that people wounded and not wounded are all at the hospital at once. So was his argument for that. So the gunners also fired on congregations of churchgoers. So one Sunday after Mass at a local Catholic church, there was a congregation of people out in the street. And the Union gunboats are going to open up and fire on them. I don't believe anybody was killed in that particular firing upon of those people, but it is something of note. They were firing on civilians, intentionally firing on hospitals. Yeah. So civilians of the town also had food confiscated farther in the beginning of the war. I guess not confiscated, but taken back from them. I guess kind of confiscated. For the Confederate war effort. So food provisions in the town are already pretty low. There's not a whole lot there to begin with. So when you add in a siege that's directly happening to the city itself, not a base somewhere near the city that they call Vicksburg, it's happening right in the city, you're going to have a shortage of food already. And obviously, as stated, on top of already being low on food. So this is going to cause a lot of people to resort to eating mules, rats, other vermin and creatures that aren't normally eaten in the American diet. So just some examples there. Now, I want to talk about total war in Jackson. So this map right here shows Vicksburg right here. So originally, that campaign that Grant's going to take is taking him around to Jackson and then back towards Vicksburg. But Johnston's army, the whole time, they're fighting Pemberton in Vicksburg. He's the Confederate general who's head of everything at Vicksburg. People at Vicksburg are wanting Johnston to come in and save them, pretty much, right? After the battle, after Vicksburg is won, Grant's going to send out Sherman in pursuit of Johnston's army. So Pemberton's already been defeated, right? He surrenders to Grant, but they still have a whole other Confederate army in the area that they have to take care of. So Grant's going to send Sherman out to pursue Johnston in Jackson. Sorry if I mixed those up before. They're pursuing Confederate General Joseph Johnston, and they're going to Jackson, the city in Mississippi. So on the way, just to kind of show this is not just the Union using total war against their enemy, this is the Confederates too. Johnston's army had poisoned a lot of the fresh water sources in the area between Vicksburg and Jackson, so in an attempt to parch the Union army before they could actually reach him. So what they would do is they would take these animals and they would put them into a river or a pond, and they would shoot the animal there and just leave the dead animal just to rot, and that would poison the whole water source. They would also pour kerosene out of lamps into water, all in an attempt to prevent Grant from pursuing them. So on their way in retaliation to this, Sherman is going to burn the farms and the civilian property that they find that's not already been burned out. A lot of it's already been damaged and destroyed, but anything left is going to be gone. They're not going to leave a whole lot on this road here. And then when they do get to Jackson, and they will defeat Johnston's army, Johnston's going to have to leave the city and give it up to the Union in what Sherman called a miniature Vicksburg. So going to be a siege, just like Vicksburg, but smaller. They're going to take that city, and then Sherman is going to create, at times, a up to 60-mile swath around the city where everything's going down. They're burning out small farms, they're destroying infrastructure, factories are gone. They're going to destroy anything around the city for up to a 60-mile radius. So overall, the effects of total war on the South and the effects of total war gained in favor of the North is that the South is going to grow more and more bitter towards the North. As the war goes on, more and more Southerners who may have been on the fence about whether or not, I am a Southerner, but I don't know how I feel about secession. More and more of those people are going to be turned over in favor of the South. And as far as Northerners go, all of this that they're doing in the Mississippi Delta area is going to be taken over later in the war when Grant's eventually going to take head of all Union armies, and you're going to start to see stuff like the March to the Sea. You're going to see the total war used in the Overland Campaign in Virginia. So they're going to take what they learned in the West and take it east with them. And that brings up another interesting topic, kind of similar to what we were talking about the Pennsylvania soldier from earlier that had seen fighting in both the East and the West. You hear a whole lot about the experiences of soldiers in different theaters when they're fighting two whole, entirely separate enemies. Kind of think like the Americans fighting the Japanese versus the Americans fighting the Germans, both in World War II. You hear about how different their experiences were. Well, that's kind of a thing in every war. The experience of a Northerner fighting in the Western theater is going to be very different than a Northerner fighting in the Eastern theater. Same with the Southerner fighting in the Western theater, Southerner fighting in the Eastern theater. They're going to be very different. And I do think that's important to remember. But overall, it's going to have a lot of effect on the rest of the war in the 1863, 64, and 65 battles that are going to come after Vicksburg, in both the East and the West, and the Trans-Mississippi Theater, can't forget about that. And it's also going to have an effect on how wars are fought in the future in general. Overall, that's kind of what I have to say on the topic. But yeah. Oh, I do have a book recommendation. Pretty much everything that is in this presentation, to an extent, not all of it, but not all the quotes, not everything, but a lot of the raw information that I got can be found in this book. It's called Vicksburg, Grant's Campaign That Broke the Confederacy by Donald Miller. So if you want to do further reading on anything in this, this is a great place to start. And then you can kind of go from there. So thank you. Have a good day.